The snow began to fall at Ashworth Park, precisely as the church bells of Little Wickham chimed 4 o'clock on Christmas Eve, as if nature herself had consulted the railway timetables and found them wanting. By 5:30, the flakes had thickened into a proper Yorkshire blizzard, transforming the Georgian manor house into something from a Christmas card, all warm golden windows glowing against the gathering dusk, and smoke rising straight as prayer from a dozen chimneys. Inside the grand salon, Lady Constance Ashworth surveyed her annual Christmas gathering with the satisfaction of a general reviewing well-ordered troops. At 68, she remained a formidable woman, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure that had not changed style in 30 years, her black silk gown adorned with the famous Ashworth diamonds that caught the firelight like captured stars. The death of her husband, Sir Reginald, the previous spring had done nothing to diminish her authority over both family and fortune. If anything, it had concentrated her power into something approaching the absolute. "More champagne, Aunt Constance?" The voice belonged to her nephew, Mr. Roderick Ashworth, a man of 42, whose handsome features had been somewhat blurred by good living and whose charm had grown increasingly desperate as his debts mounted. He stood beside the magnificent Christmas tree, a towering Norway spruce that dominated one end of the salon, its branches heavy with crystal ornaments and silver tinsel. "I think not, Roderick," Lady Constance replied with the faint smile she reserved for relatives who presumed too much upon her affection. "Perhaps you might consider following my example in that regard." A flush crept up Roderick's neck, but before he could respond, his sister Diana intervened with the practiced ease of one accustomed to smoothing over family tensions. Mrs. Diana Hartwell, at 38, possessed the kind of understated elegance that spoke of good breeding and careful economy. Her husband's medical practice in Harrogate provided a comfortable but not luxurious living, and her presence at Ashworth Park was as much necessity as pleasure. "The tree is magnificent this year, Aunt," Diana said, moving to stand between her brother and their hostess. "The children would have loved to see it." "Yes, a pity about the measles," Lady Constance agreed, though her tone suggested she found the absence of Diana's 3 young children more convenient than regrettable. "Dr. Pemberton assures me the epidemic in the village is quite contained." Dr. Marcus Pemberton, the family physician and a long-time friend, nodded gravely from his position near the fireplace. A man of 60, with prematurely white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, he had attended the Ashworth family for over 20 years and was privy to more of their secrets than was entirely comfortable. "Indeed, Lady Constance, though I must say this weather will make my rounds rather challenging tomorrow." "Surely you're not thinking of leaving us on Christmas Day, Doctor?" The question came from Miss Evelyn Courtenay, Lady Constance's companion and secretary, a woman of 40 whose quiet efficiency had made her indispensable to the household. She sat in a chair near the window, her needlework forgotten in her lap as she watched the snow swirl past the glass. "I fear duty calls, Miss Courtenay," Dr. Pemberton replied, "though at this rate I may find myself your involuntary guest until the roads are cleared." It was at this moment that Higgins, the butler whose service to the family spanned 4 decades, appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely concealed perturbation. "I beg your pardon, my lady," he said in his carefully modulated voice, "but there is a gentleman at the door. He claims to have been invited, though I have no record of his name in the guest book." Lady Constance's eyes narrowed. "What is his name, Higgins?" "A Mr. Silas Blackwood, my lady. He presents a most curious invitation, one that appears to bear Sir Reginald's signature, though dated some 20 years past." A silence fell over the salon, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the whisper of snow against the windows. Roderick's glass paused halfway to his lips, and Diana's embroidery hoop slipped from her fingers. Even Miss Courtenay looked up sharply from her needlework. "Blackwood," Lady Constance repeated slowly. "I know no one by that name." "If I may, my lady," Higgins continued with obvious reluctance, The gentleman appears to be in some distress. His motor car has become stranded in the drive, and the storm shows no sign of abating. The laws of hospitality were as immutable as those of physics, particularly in a house like Ashworth Park. Lady Constance's lips compressed into a thin line, but she nodded curtly. Very well. Show him in, Higgins. We shall sort out this mystery of the invitation presently. The man who entered the salon a few moments later seemed to bring the winter cold with him. Mr. Silas Blackwood was tall and gaunt, perhaps 50 years of age, with iron-grey hair and eyes of such pale blue they appeared almost colourless. His overcoat, though well-made, had seen better days, and there was something in his bearing that suggested a gentleman who had known prosperity and lost it. He carried himself with the rigid posture of one who has learned to mask disappointment with dignity. "Lady Ashworth," he said, bowing slightly, "I cannot express my gratitude for your hospitality. I fear I should have frozen to death in my motor had you not admitted me." "Mr. Blackwood," Lady Constance replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Higgins tells me you have an invitation from my late husband. Perhaps you would be so kind as to explain the circumstances." Blackwood reached into his coat and withdrew a yellowed envelope, which he handed to Lady Constance with something approaching ceremony. "Sir Reginald and I were business associates. Many years ago, he was kind enough to extend a standing invitation to spend Christmas at Ashworth Park, should I ever find myself in Yorkshire during the season. I confess I had not thought to accept until circumstances made it advisable." Lady Constance examined the envelope with the care of a jeweller appraising a suspicious stone. The paper was indeed aged, and the handwriting appeared to be her late husband's, though she could not recall him ever mentioning anyone named Blackwood. "The date on this invitation is December 1903, she observed. Indeed, Sir Reginald was most generous in making it open-ended. 20 years is rather a long time to wait before accepting an invitation, Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Pemberton observed mildly. Blackwood's pale eyes fixed on the doctor with an intensity that made the older man shift uncomfortably. "Sometimes, Doctor, circumstances require patience, and sometimes they require resolution." Before anyone could ask what he meant by this cryptic remark, the sound of sleigh bells could be heard approaching through the storm. Higgins appeared once more in the doorway, his expression now one of complete bewilderment. "I beg your pardon, my lady, but there is another gentleman at the door, a foreign gentleman who claims to be expected, a Mr. Hercule Poirot." If the mention of Silas Blackwood had caused surprise, the name of Hercule Poirot created something approaching consternation. Lady Constance's face went quite pale, and Roderick actually dropped his champagne glass, sending crystal shards scattering across the Persian carpet. "Poirot," Diana whispered. "The Belgian detective." "I sent for no detective," Lady Constance said sharply, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Nevertheless, madam," came a precise, accented voice from the doorway, "Hercule Poirot is here, and at your service." The little Belgian detective stepped into the salon with the quiet confidence of a man who was never truly unwelcome, regardless of the circumstances of his arrival. Despite the harsh weather, his appearance was immaculate. His dark coat brushed to perfection, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his famous mustache waxed to mathematical precision. His dark eyes, bright with intelligence, took in every detail of the room and its occupants with the systematic thoroughness of a cataloguing librarian. "May excuses for the intrusion," Poirot continued, removing his gloves with careful deliberation. "I received a most urgent telegram this afternoon requesting my immediate presence at Ashworth Park. The message indicated that a matter of life and death required my attention." He reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a yellow telegraph form which he examined with the care of a scholar studying an ancient manuscript. "The telegram was sent from Little Wickham Post Office at 2:30 this afternoon. It reads, 'Come at once to Ashworth Park. Murder will be committed tonight unless you prevent it. Signed, a friend of justice.'" The silence that followed this pronouncement was so complete that the ticking of the mantel clock seemed to echo like thunder. Every person in the room appeared frozen, as if Poirot's words had cast a spell over them. "Murder?" Miss Courtney's voice was barely audible. "This is preposterous," Roderick said, though his voice shook slightly. "Who would send such a telegram?" "Ah, mon ami, that is indeed the question," Poirot replied, his keen gaze moving from face to face, cataloguing expressions, noting the telltale signs of guilt, fear, and surprise that flickered across each countenance like shadows cast by the dancing flames. "But experience has taught me that when someone takes the trouble to summon Hercule Poirot, there is invariably good reason." Lady Constance struggled to regain her composure. "Mr. Poirot, I assure you this is all a terrible mistake. No one in this house has any intention of committing murder. You have been brought here under false pretenses." "Perhaps," Poirot agreed mildly. "And yet, the little grey cells, they tell me that someone in this room believes murder is not only possible, but inevitable. And now, with the storm making departure impossible, we find ourselves in what the English call a closed circle. How very convenient for getting to the bottom of this mystery." As if summoned by his words, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, and several of the electric lights flickered ominously. Outside, the snow continued to fall in thick, heavy flakes that had already begun to drift against the manor's walls. Dr. Pemberton cleared his throat nervously. "Surely the roads are completely impassable by now. The storm has been raging for hours." "Indeed," Poirot observed, with what might have been satisfaction. "It appears that fate has arranged matters most conveniently. We are all, as you say, snowed in together until the storm passes." Lady Constance's hand tightened on the arm of her chair. "Higgins, prepare rooms for both gentlemen. It seems we have no choice but to extend our hospitality." "Very good, my lady," Higgins replied, though his usual composure seemed somewhat strained. As the butler withdrew to make the necessary arrangements, an uncomfortable silence settled over the salon. The arrival of two unexpected guests, one bearing an ancient invitation, the other summoned by an anonymous telegram warning of murder, had transformed what should have been a peaceful Christmas Eve into something far more sinister. It was Silas Blackwood who broke the silence, his pale eyes fixed on Poirot with an expression that might have been amusement. "How fascinating," he said quietly. "It seems I am not the only uninvited guest this evening. Tell me, Mr. Poirot, do you believe in coincidences?" Poirot's moustache twitched slightly. "Coincidences, monsieur, are like the English weather. They exist, but one should never rely upon them. In my experience, when two unexpected guests arrive at the same house on the same evening, it is rarely by chance." The little detective settled himself into an empty chair with the air of a man who intended to stay exactly where he was. His presence seemed to fill the room, making everyone acutely aware that they were now under observation by one of the most brilliant minds in Europe. "Now then," Poirot said pleasantly, his eyes twinkling with what might have been anticipation, "perhaps someone would be so kind as to tell me about this family gathering. I could not help but notice a certain tension in the air when I arrived. And in my experience, where there is family tension at Christmas, there is often motive for murder." Outside, the wind howled around Ashworth Park with increasing ferocity, and the snow continued to fall, sealing the manor house away from the outside world. Inside, 6 people sat in a circle around the fire, each harboring secrets, each with reasons to fear what the night might bring. The stage was set, the players were in position, and somewhere in the shadows, a murderer was preparing to strike. Christmas Eve at Ashworth Park had taken a decidedly sinister turn. The transition from drawing room to dining room proceeded with the strained formality of a funeral cortege. Lady Constance had insisted that dinner be served precisely at 8, as if the rigid adherence to schedule might somehow restore normalcy to a situation that had spiraled far beyond her control. The great dining room, with its gleaming mahogany table and ancestral portraits gazing down from gilded frames, provided a stage both grand and intimate for the evening's unfolding drama. Poirot, having somehow produced impeccable evening dress from his modest traveling case, took his assigned seat with the quiet satisfaction of a chess master surveying the board. His keen eyes catalogued every detail, the way Roderick's hands trembled as he reached for his wine-glass, the manner in which Diana kept glancing toward the storm-lashed windows, the rigid tension in Miss Courtney's shoulders as she maintained her perfect posture. "Before we proceed with our excellent dinner," Poirot said pleasantly, dabbing his lips with his napkin, "perhaps we might indulge in a small exercise. Nothing elaborate, merely a simple accounting of where each person was at 2:30 this afternoon when our mysterious telegram was dispatched." Roderick's fork clattered against his plate. "Is that really necessary? We're hardly criminals, you know." "Ah, but mon ami, it is precisely because you are not criminals that this will be so simple," Poirot replied with a gentle smile. "Lady Constance, if you would be so kind." "I was in my sitting room," Lady Constance replied crisply, "attending to correspondence. Miss Courtney brought me the afternoon post at 2:45. Miss Courtney nodded confirmation. "I was in the library most of the day, arranging place cards and Christmas gifts. I telephoned the poulterer just after 2, then took the post upstairs." Dr. Pemberton adjusted his spectacles. "I was making rounds in the village from noon until 3. Called on old Mrs. Grover and the rector. Passed the post office on my way back. Waved to Mrs. Finch through the window, though I didn't go in." "And you, Monsieur Roderick?" "On the estate with Cole, the manager," Roderick said, his voice slightly defensive. "Checking drainage in the south meadow. Returned just after 4. Madame Diana." "I never left the house. Sorted the children's Christmas parcels in the morning room, then wrote to my husband in Harrogate at 2:30. He's quite upset about the quarantine, you understand?" Poirot nodded thoughtfully, filing away each response. "Most illuminating. And you, Monsieur Blackwood?" "Driving from York," Blackwood replied, his pale eyes unblinking. "The roads were already treacherous. I reached your gates at 20 minutes past 5. "Excellent." Poirot set down his wine-glass with precise delicacy. "Now then, I observe that this household has certain financial pressures that might concern a man of business." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Lady Constance's diamonds caught the candlelight as she stiffened. "I beg your pardon?" "Forgive me, madame, but the little grey cells, they notice things. Monsieur Roderick's recent investments have not prospered, n'est-ce pas? And Madame Diana, comfortable though her husband's practice may be, finds herself dependent upon family generosity for the finer things in life. Miss Courtney's position, while secure, relies entirely upon your continued favor." "How dare you?" Roderick began, but Blackwood's quiet voice cut through his indignation. "Sir Reginald always said that money was the root of most evil, Mr. Poirot, though he was remarkably adept at accumulating it nonetheless." The stranger's thin smile held no warmth. "Tell me, Lady Constance, does the key to his study still rest in the blue porcelain bowl on the mantelpiece?" The effect was electric. Higgins, entering with the next course, nearly dropped his silver tray. Lady Constance went rigid, her face draining of color. "How could you possibly know that?" she whispered. 20 years ago I knew this house rather well," Blackwood replied. "I spent many evenings in Sir Reginald's study, discussing business matters of considerable delicacy. The Colonel was often present at those meetings. Your late husband's brother, James. A troubled man, was he not? The war had affected him deeply." Dr. Pemberton frowned. "I don't recall Sir Reginald mentioning any business associates named Blackwood." "There are many things Sir Reginald chose not to mention, Doctor, particularly regarding certain ventures in South Africa. The Colonel and I served together, you see. We witnessed things that changed us both. When we returned to England, Sir Reginald was most generous in offering investment opportunities. though I suspect his generosity was motivated more by guilt than friendship. At that moment, the lights flickered and died, plunging the dining room into the wavering glow of candlelight. In the sudden darkness, someone gasped. Whether from surprise or fear, Poirot could not determine. "Everyone remain calm," Dr. Pemberton's voice came through the gloom. "Merely the storm affecting the power lines." When Higgins restored the lights moments later, Poirot noted the faces around the table with professional interest. Fear, guilt, calculation, each emotion flickered across the assembled countenances like shadows cast by dancing flames. "How very atmospheric," Blackwood observed with dark humor. "Rather like the old days in the trenches when darkness revealed truths that daylight concealed." Poirot's mustache twitched thoughtfully. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves in his mind. An old debt, a guilty secret, a household balanced on the knife's edge of financial ruin. And somewhere among these civilized people sat a killer, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The storm raged on outside, sealing them all within Ashworth Park's ancient walls. Christmas Eve had become something far more sinister than a family gathering. It had become a trap. The withdrawal from the dining room proceeded with all the strained formality of a retreat from battle. Lady Constance led the procession to the library, with her customary dignity intact, though Poirot's keen eyes detected the slight tremor in her hands as she arranged the coffee service. The revelation of Blackwood's intimate knowledge of the household had clearly shaken her more than she cared to admit, and the little Belgian detective filed this observation away with the methodical precision of a scholar cataloguing rare manuscripts. The library itself was a testament to generations of Ashworth prosperity. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, their gilt titles gleaming in the firelight. Persian carpets muffled footsteps, and the air carried the comforting scent of beeswax and old paper. Yet tonight, the room's usual atmosphere of scholarly peace felt oppressive, as if the very walls were holding their breath. "Coffee, Mr. Poirot." Miss Courtney's offer came with her usual quiet efficiency, though Poirot noted the rigid set of her shoulders as she moved between the guests. She had perfected the art of invisibility that all good companions must master, yet something in her manner tonight suggested a woman walking on increasingly thin ice. "Most kind, mademoiselle." Poirot accepted the delicate porcelain cup and settled into a wing-back chair positioned to observe the entire room. "I find myself curious about this study that Monsieur Blackwood mentioned, the one with the blue porcelain bowl containing the key." The effect was immediate. Roderick's brandy glass froze halfway to his lips, and Diana's embroidery hoop slipped forgotten from her fingers. Even Higgins, entering with additional coffee, seemed to stiffen at the mention of Sir Reginald's private sanctum. "The study has been locked since my husband's death," Lady Constance said carefully. "His papers and personal effects remain undisturbed." Blackwood's thin smile held no warmth. "Ah, but some papers have a way of disturbing the living, don't they, Lady Constance? Particularly those concerning certain mining ventures in the Transvaal." The Colonel was quite specific in his letters about those profitable investments, though not entirely legitimate ones. Dr. Pemberton leaned forward sharply. "Are you suggesting Sir Reginald was involved in something improper?" "I am suggesting, Doctor, that your late friend understood the value of keeping certain business associates satisfied. The Colonel and we knew things that could have been embarrassing to a man of Sir Reginald's standing. His generosity toward us was therefore quite understandable." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Poirot observed the interplay of glances around the room with fascination. Fear, anger, calculation, and desperation flickered across faces with the rapidity of summer lightning. "These letters of which you speak," Poirot said conversationally, "where might they be found now?" "Safe, Mr. Poirot. Quite safe, though I suspect their location might become a matter of some urgency before this evening is concluded." At that moment, a tremendous crash echoed through the house. followed by the sound of splintering wood and breaking glass. The very building seemed to shudder, and several guests started from their chairs. Higgins appeared in the doorway, his usually impeccable composure badly shaken. "I beg your pardon, my lady, but one of the great oaks has fallen across the conservatory. The storm has brought it down, smashed right through the glass roof, and severed the telephone lines. We are now completely cut off." The implications were not lost on anyone present. They were now truly isolated. 8 people trapped in an ancient house with a potential murderer among them, and no possibility of summoning help until the storm passed. Poirot's eyes glittered with what might have been professional satisfaction. "How very convenient. It appears our mysterious correspondent calculated the weather most precisely." He rose with deliberate care. "Lady Constance, perhaps you would be so kind as to show me this study. I find myself most curious about Sir Reginald's papers." The study was reached through a short corridor lined with portraits of previous Ashworths, their painted eyes seeming to follow the small procession. Lady Constance produced an ornate key from her reticule, not, Poirot noted, from any blue porcelain bowl. "I moved the key after my husband's death," she explained, catching his questioning glance. "Too many people knew of its usual location." The study itself was a masculine retreat. Dark paneling, a massive desk facing the fireplace, and shelves lined with account books and legal documents. Over the mantelpiece hung Sir Reginald's portrait, painted in oils that captured his bluff good humor and confident bearing. Yet Poirot's attention was drawn immediately to the desk, where a rectangular outline in the dust showed where something had recently been removed. "There was a photograph here," he observed. Lady Constance's lips tightened. "Of my brother-in-law, Colonel James. I removed it some months ago." "The colonel who died in this very room," Blackwood added softly from the doorway. "On Christmas Eve, 1919. Shot himself, they said, though some of us wondered about the circumstances." Diana gasped. "Uncle James committed suicide. Why was I never told?" "Because it was ruled an accident," Lady Constance said with steel in her voice, "and because it does not concern you." Poirot moved to the window, where his fingertips detected a slight film of dust on the sill, except for one clear crescent mark, as if someone had recently pressed their hand there while peering out into the storm. Behind the desk, a section of paneling stood slightly ajar, revealing the dark mouth of a wall safe. "The safe was open when I found it this afternoon," Miss Courtney said quietly. "I thought Higgins had been airing the room, so I closed it." "I had not been in the study today," Higgins replied stiffly. Poirot examined the safe's mechanism with interest. No signs of forcing. Whoever opened it possessed either the combination or considerable skill. He turned to face the assembled group. "Now then, I think it is time for some small interviews. Dr. Pemberton, perhaps you would be so kind as to begin." They returned to the morning room, where Poirot positioned himself to observe each subject carefully. Dr. Pemberton removed his spectacles and polished them nervously. "You passed the post office at 2:30 today?" "Approximately, yes. Mrs. Finch was at her window with her knitting. Yet you did not enter to send a telegram." "I had no need, though I suppose someone could have telephoned one in. It's quite common in weather like this." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "You knew Colonel James well?" "As well as anyone could. The war had shattered him, what we now call shell shock. He drank heavily and brooded constantly, but he was not a violent man, except perhaps toward himself." Miss Courtney was next, her hands folded primly in her lap. Under Poirot's gentle questioning, she revealed her intimate knowledge of the household's financial pressures, the telephone system, and the various tensions that simmered beneath Ashworth Park's genteel surface. "You manage the household accounts, mademoiselle?" "Yes, and the telephones when necessary." "And you are aware that one may telephone a telegram to be transmitted?" Her lashes lifted in surprise, then lowered. "Yes, that is quite possible." When she had gone, Poirot stood alone in the quiet room, listening to the storm's relentless assault on the ancient house. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves in his mind. Old debts, guilty secrets, financial desperation, and a household balanced precariously on the edge of ruin. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the snow-lashed windows, he sensed that events were moving toward their inevitable climax. The mysterious telegram had not been sent in jest. Someone in this house genuinely feared that murder would be committed before morning. And now, with the telephone lines severed and the roads impassable, they were all trapped together in a deadly game where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. Poirot straightened his waistcoat and checked his pocket watch. It was barely 9 o'clock. A long night lay ahead, and somewhere in the shadows of Ashworth Park, a killer was preparing to strike. The little grey cells would need to work very quickly indeed. Poirot's methodical approach to interviewing began with the most volatile member of the household. Roderick Ashworth entered the morning room with the forced bravado of a man attempting to mask considerable anxiety, his movements betraying the nervous energy of someone whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble around him. "You have debts, Monsieur Roderick," Poirot observed without preamble, settling back in his chair with the patient air of a confessor. "Considerable debts, I suspect, that your aunt's generosity has not entirely resolved." Roderick's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the brandy decanter. "My investments have been challenging, but that's hardly unusual in these uncertain times." "Indeed. And yet your boots tell an interesting story." Poirot's keen eyes fixed on Roderick's perfectly polished evening shoes. "You claim to have been on the estate with Monsieur Cole until 4 o'clock, checking drainage in the south meadow. Wet work, surely, in such weather. Yet Higgins brought your bags up at 6, and your valet mentioned that your evening shoes still contained their cedar blocks when he laid out your clothes." The color drained from Roderick's face. I changed after returning. One does not come to dinner in muddy boots." "But of course not. Yet the cedar blocks suggest these shoes had not been worn recently, which means you were in the house much earlier than you claimed. Perhaps by 3 o'clock? Poirot's voice remained gentle, but his eyes were razor-sharp. "What brought you back so early, monsieur?" Roderick's composure finally cracked. He reached into his inner pocket with shaking fingers and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper. "This was left in my room while I dressed for dinner. No signature, just initials." Poirot examined the note with professional interest. The handwriting was bold, masculine. "Bring the letters, or I speak tonight. S.B." Most illuminating. And what letters might these be? "I haven't the faintest idea," Roderick said desperately. "Some blackmail scheme, surely. But you see what this means. Blackwood has been manipulating us all from the moment he arrived." Diana Hartwell's interview revealed a woman of considerably more self-control than her brother, though Poirot's trained eye detected the subtle signs of strain beneath her composed exterior. Her hands bore faint ink stains, and there was a tightness around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and mounting financial pressures. "You wrote to your husband at precisely 2:30, Poirot noted. "A letter of some urgency, perhaps?" "My children are quarantined with measles. Harold is naturally concerned." Diana's voice carried the crisp authority of a woman accustomed to managing household crises, yet something in her manner suggested deeper anxieties. "And this letter was posted immediately?" A slight hesitation. "I gave it to Higgins for the evening collection." "Yet you are familiar with the telephone system here. One might, for instance, place a call to the post office to dictate a telegram." Diana's carefully maintained composure flickered. "I suppose so, though I cannot imagine why I would need to." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Tell me about your Uncle James, Colonel James. His death in the study on Christmas Eve, 1919. The question struck home like a physical blow. Diana's hands clenched in her lap. "I was away at finishing school. Mother told me it was a hunting accident, a gun that misfired while he was cleaning it. But there were always whispers, suggestions that the war had affected his mind. And your financial situation, madame? Is it as secure as your charming demeanor suggests? My husband's practice provides adequately, but not luxuriously. Aunt Constance is generous, but her generosity comes with expectations, and sometimes those expectations feel like chains. The most revealing interview, however, came from Higgins, whose decades of loyal service had made him privy to the household's most intimate secrets. The butler stood at rigid attention, his professional demeanor intact, despite the evening's disturbing developments. "You observe much in this house, Higgins," Poirot said conversationally. "This afternoon, who went to the east corridor near the study?" "Miss Courtney, sir. Twice. Once at 2 o'clock for dusting, and again at 3:30. Mr. Roderick passed that way at 10 minutes past 3, though he claimed to be on the estate until 4. Dr. Pemberton did not return until after 3:30. "And the gun-room, Higgins? Are all weapons accounted for?" A fractional hesitation, barely perceptible, but Poirot caught it. "As of last week, yes, sir. Sir Reginald's cases were sealed after his death. The Colonel's Webley." He paused. "The strap broke some years ago. I set it aside for repair." The gun-room examination revealed what Poirot had suspected. The glass-fronted case held an empty space where Colonel James's service revolver should have rested. The velvet lining bore the clear impression of the missing weapon, and in the drawer below, a box of .455 cartridges showed 2 vacant spaces. "When did you last check this case, Higgins?" "Yesterday morning, sir. I dusted regularly. The Webley was there then." "So between yesterday morning and this evening, someone took both the weapon and ammunition." Poirot's eyes glittered with professional interest. "Most convenient timing, would you not agree?" The final piece of the puzzle emerged during his brief encounter with Silas Blackwood in the library. The gaunt stranger sat by the fire, his pale eyes reflecting the dancing flames with an intensity that suggested a man accustomed to violence. "You served in South Africa with Colonel James," Poirot observed. "We shared certain experiences that bound us together, and certain knowledge that made us valuable to Sir Reginald. Knowledge that might prove embarrassing to the family?" Blackwood's thin smile held no warmth. "Truth has a way of surfacing, Mr. Poirot, even after 20 years. As the evening progressed toward its inevitable climax, Lady Constance made her decision with characteristic authority. Standing before the assembled household, she announced that Blackwood would be confined to the Blue Room in the West Wing, ostensibly for his comfort, but clearly for everyone's peace of mind. "I will not have my household disrupted by wild accusations and ancient grudges," she declared, her diamonds catching the firelight like ice crystals. "Mr. Blackwood will be comfortable, but contained until this storm passes." Blackwood accepted his confinement with the resigned dignity of a man who had endured worse fates. "I have been imprisoned in less comfortable quarters, Lady Constance, though I wonder if you truly believe that walls can contain the truth." As the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 10, Poirot stood alone in the morning room, his mind working with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. The missing weapon, the anonymous telegram, the financial desperation, the old secrets, all the elements were converging toward an inevitable conclusion. Someone in this house had taken Colonel James's revolver with murderous intent. The telegram warning of tonight's violence had not been sent in jest. And now, with Blackwood confined and the household settling into an uneasy peace, the stage was set for the final act of a drama that had been 20 years in the making. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on Ashworth Park, sealing them all within the ancient walls like pieces on a chessboard. The little grey cells worked furiously, sorting through lies and half-truths, seeking the pattern that would reveal the killer's identity. Time was running short, and somewhere in the darkness, a murderer was preparing to strike. The household dispersed with the brittle courtesy of actors leaving a stage where the performance had gone badly wrong. Lady Constance's announcement that Blackwood would be confined to the Blue Room had restored a semblance of order, yet Poirot observed with professional interest how each person's relief manifested differently. Roderick's hands had finally stopped trembling, Diana's rigid posture had softened slightly, and even Miss Courtney had resumed her habitual efficiency in clearing away the coffee service. Yet the little Belgian detective remained unconvinced by this convenient resolution. As he accepted Higgins' escort to the Rose Room, his sharp eyes catalogued every detail of the route: the creaking floorboard near the linen closet, the loose carpet runner at the head of the stairs, the grandfather clock whose funeral chimes echoed through the corridors. Experience had taught him that when a household breathed too easily after a threat was contained, the real danger often remained hidden in plain sight. The Night Watch. Poirot, who disliked the aimless wandering of anxious people, had requested that everyone maintain to their chambers after 11 o'clock until midnight. It sounded routine and domesticated, but experienced investigators know the value of routine. It reveals who cannot abide it. When there is a cat, he had told Lady Constance, one sits very still. The suggestion of sitting still would have been admirable had it been obeyed. At 10 minutes to 11, as the storm pressed its great white face against the windows, Poirot emerged from his room and moved through the darkened corridors with the silent precision of a professional. His destination was not random. The little grey cells had been working steadily, and certain conclusions demanded verification. The study door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap came the soft sound of papers being shuffled. Poirot positioned himself in the shadows, observing with professional interest as a figure moved stealthily through Sir Reginald's private domain, searching through desk drawers with systematic thoroughness. When the figure straightened, Poirot stepped into the doorway. "Bonsoir, Miss Courtney. I trust you have found what you are seeking." The companion spun around, her usually composed features twisted with desperation. In her hands, she clutched a leather portfolio, its contents spilling onto the Persian carpet like autumn leaves. "Mr. Poirot, I was merely checking that everything was secure after this afternoon's disturbance." "At 11:30 at night? How very thorough of you." Poirot's voice remained gentle, but his eyes were steel. "Perhaps you would explain why you felt the need to open the safe once more?" Miss Courtney's composure crumbled entirely. She sank into Sir Reginald's chair, the portfolio clutched against her chest like a shield. "You don't understand. These papers, they would destroy everything. Lady Constance's reputation, the family's standing, and your own position, naturellement. Tell me, mademoiselle, how long have you known about Sir Reginald's irregular business dealings?" The confession. The question struck home with devastating accuracy. Miss Courtney's shoulders sagged as 20 years of carefully maintained secrets finally found their voice. "Since 1919, she whispered. "I was young then, newly appointed as Lady Constance's companion. Colonel James came to the study one night, drunk and raving about blood money and stolen claims in the Transvaal. Sir Reginald tried to calm him, but James was beyond reason. He accused his brother of profiting from the misery of others, of using information gained through military connections to acquire mining rights that belonged to dead men." "And what did you observe that Christmas Eve?" "I was arranging flowers in the hall when I heard the shouting. Colonel James was demanding money, not charity, he said, but what was owed to him and his dead comrades. Sir Reginald refused, said he had paid enough over the years. Then," she shuddered, "there was a shot." Poirot's mustache twitched thoughtfully. "You saw what happened." The door was ajar. Colonel James had taken the revolver from the desk drawer. Sir Reginald kept it there for protection. But when he pulled the trigger, the gun was pointed at Sir Reginald, not himself. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. "So it was murder, not suicide, and you have kept this secret for 20 years. Sir Reginald died instantly." Colonel James stood there, staring at what he had done, then turned the gun on himself. When the servants came running, they found 2 bodies and assumed it was a tragic accident followed by suicide. Lady Constance was in London. She never knew the truth. The attack. At that moment, the house shattered with a report that turned blood to ice. A revolver shot, no mistaking that brutal sound. A woman cried out from somewhere beyond the billiard room. Poirot was already running, Miss Courtney close behind, the portfolio forgotten on Sir Reginald's desk. They found the household converging on the blue room in various states of undress. The door hung askew, its chainplate torn from the wood. Poirot reached it first to find Higgins already examining the damage. "The chain," the butler panted. "He's put up the chain, but something's torn it free." The blue room, with its china shepherdesses and pale curtains, should have been the prettiest refuge in the house. Instead, it presented a tableau, both theatrical and squalid. The window stood wide open, snow blown in to dapple the carpet like spilled salt. Near the hearth, Silas Blackwood lay in a crumpled heap, one hand to his temple, blood tracking down his cheek. On the carpet, inches from his outstretched fingers, lay the heavy Webley revolver. One of the dainty shepherdesses lay decapitated upon the grate, and in the plaster beside the chimney breast, a dark pucker showed where a bullet had struck. Dr. Pemberton was at Blackwood's side instantly. "Grazed, superficial. He's fainted from shock." Blackwood's eyes fluttered open, staring up at the ring of faces with curious detachment. Not dead, then. Disappointing. For someone. The investigation. Poirot did not join the chorus of accusations that immediately followed. Instead, he bent with the deliberation of a man examining fine lace. Where the chain plate had torn from the wood, something caught the candlelight, a faint, almost invisible gleam. He touched it, and his fingertip came away with a whisper of resistance. A thread, black, fine as hair, bridged the torn screw hole to the chain itself, looped in such a way that it might be tugged from the corridor. "Mr. Blackwood," he said softly, "who visited you?" "No one. I followed your orders and opened to no one." Then a draft, a noise at the window. Something moved behind me, and stars. When I woke, I tasted iron. Poirot crossed to the window, noting how the sill was drifted with snow but showed no prints in the white scatter. The iron latch was brittle with cold. "Higgins, how high is the drop?" "Straight down to the conservatory roof, sir. With that oak across it, there's no getting to it from outside, and no getting away, neither." Miss Courtney, her earlier confession forgotten in the chaos, moved to the small writing table. "Mr. Poirot, this." She held up an envelope addressed in a bold hand to Lady Constance, its seal unbroken. Lady Constance broke the wax with gloved fingers. Inside lay a single sheet. "Bring the letters to the study at midnight, alone, or everything goes to the press. S.B." "There is your proof," Roderick declared, but his voice lacked conviction. Blackwood smiled without humor. "If I wished leverage, Lady Ashworth, I would not announce the hour and place to a household of 8 nervous people." The deduction. Poirot delicately picked free the frail strand of thread from the door frame, snapping it between thumb and forefinger as one might kill a cobweb. Someone has practiced with strings and chains, someone who enjoys contrivances, someone for whom the little mechanics are a pleasure, not a chore. He knelt by the fireplace and used the tongs to lift a half-burned scrap from the coals, a fragment bearing a faint blue stamp and the ghost of printed letters. "Little Wick." The pieces were arranging themselves in his mind with mathematical precision. The staged attack, the mechanical contrivance of the chain, the convenient note left behind, all the hallmarks of a mind that preferred theatrical effect to simple efficiency. Most telling of all, the missing Webley had been used not to kill, but to wound and frighten. The person who sent the telegram believed that murder would be committed tonight, Poirot announced to the assembled household. He wished it prevented, but the true killer remains among us, hidden behind this elaborate charade. As the grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight, Poirot straightened his waistcoat with characteristic precision. The night's revelations had illuminated much. Miss Courtney's 20-year secret, the truth about Colonel James's death, the staged attack on Blackwood. Yet the most dangerous game was still being played, and somewhere in the shadows of Ashworth Park, a murderer was preparing for the final act. The storm raged on outside, sealing them all within the ancient walls where justice delayed had become justice perverted, and the sins of the past were finally demanding their terrible price. The aftermath of the Blue Room incident had scattered the household like startled birds, each retreating to the supposed safety of their chambers while casting fearful glances over their shoulders. Yet Poirot remained behind, his methodical nature compelling him to examine every detail of what he was increasingly certain had been an elaborate piece of theater rather than a genuine assassination attempt. The evidence speaks. Moving with the deliberate precision of a jeweler examining a rare stone, Poirot knelt beside the torn door chain, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail. The black thread he had discovered earlier was not common household cotton, but something far more specialized. He held it to the lamplight, noting its lustrous quality and unusual strength. "Surgical thread," he murmured to himself, rolling the fiber between his fingers. "Black silk, waxed for strength, the kind used by a medical man to tie off arteries during operations." The implication was clear. Someone with access to medical supplies had orchestrated this theatrical attack. The chain had been manipulated from outside the room using a carefully prepared mechanism designed to create the illusion of forced entry while leaving the perpetrator safely in the corridor. When Poirot made his way to the study, he discovered what he had half expected. The leather portfolio Miss Courtney had abandoned in her earlier panic was gone. The desk bore the faint warmth of recent handling, and in the Persian carpet he found another fragment of the telltale black thread, hastily snapped and overlooked in someone's haste to remove the incriminating documents. The doctor's burden. It was then that Dr. Pemberton appeared in the doorway, his usually composed features etched with desperation and something approaching relief. In his hands, he clutched a bundle of yellowed letters tied with black ribbon. "Mr. Poirot," the doctor said, his voice heavy with 20 years of suppressed guilt, "I cannot bear this charade any longer. These letters, they contain truths that have poisoned this household for decades." Poirot settled into Sir Reginald's chair, his expression one of patient understanding. "Please, doctor, the time for secrets has passed." The confession that followed revealed layers of corruption and desperation that had festered beneath Ashworth Park's genteel surface. Colonel James had indeed suffered from shell shock, but his condition had been complicated by a morphine addiction, a common enough affliction among wounded soldiers, but devastating for a man of his social standing. "I had been treating James for his war injuries," Dr. Pemberton explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "But he began stealing medical supplies from my practice, selling them to support his growing dependency. When I discovered the thefts, he threatened to expose my own irregular arrangement with Sir Reginald." "Which was?" "I had been providing Sir Reginald with confidential information about his business rival's health conditions. Nothing that directly harmed my patients, you understand, but information that proved valuable in certain negotiations. James discovered this arrangement and demanded money to keep silent." The picture that emerged was one of a household built on a foundation of moral compromise, where each member harbored secrets that made them vulnerable to blackmail and manipulation. Miss Courtney's complete truth. When Miss Courtney was summoned to provide her account once more, the full scope of the Christmas Eve tragedy finally emerged. Her earlier confession had been incomplete, a protective fabrication designed to shield both herself and the family from the complete truth. "I was not in the hall arranging flowers," she admitted, her composure finally cracking entirely. "I was in the study with Sir Reginald when Colonel James arrived. He was in a morphine haze, barely coherent, but absolutely convinced that his brother owed him a fortune from their South African ventures. The confrontation had been uglier than anyone had imagined. Colonel James, desperate and delusional, had indeed taken Sir Reginald's revolver from the desk drawer. But the shooting had been the result of a struggle, not a cold-blooded execution. Sir Reginald tried to take the gun away, Miss Courtenay continued. In the struggle, it discharged. Sir Reginald fell, and James stood there, staring at what he had done. Then he turned the gun on himself. Dr. Pemberton arrived moments later, and together we arranged things to look like an accident followed by suicide. The theatrical deception. With these revelations in hand, Poirot began to piece together the evening's elaborate charade. Someone had used the household's knowledge of these old secrets to create a complex web of misdirection, staging the attack on Blackwood to deflect attention from their true purpose. The person who sent the anonymous telegram knew that murder was indeed planned for tonight, Poirot announced to the reassembled household. But not the theatrical attack we witnessed in the Blue Room. That was merely the overture to a more deadly symphony. He produced the black thread fragments, explaining how the door chain had been manipulated using surgical silk, a material readily available to someone with medical connections. The attack had been carefully calculated to wound but not kill, creating chaos while the real crime was committed elsewhere. The missing evidence. Returning to the study with the entire household in tow, Poirot made his most significant discovery. The safe, which had been closed when Miss Courtenay left the portfolio on the desk, now stood open and completely empty. But on the carpet before it lay a small, gleaming object that would prove crucial to unraveling the night's mysteries. A mother-of-pearl button, Poirot observed, lifting the tiny object with his handkerchief. The kind used to fasten a lady's cuff. Dropped in haste, no doubt, when our thief realized that time was running short. The button's iridescent surface caught the lamplight, shifting from grey to pink to green like truth itself, changing as it was examined from different angles. Someone in their midst had orchestrated an elaborate deception, using the chaos of Blackwood's staged attack to cover their theft of the incriminating documents. The gathering storm. As the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 1 o'clock in the morning, Poirot surveyed the assembled household with the satisfaction of a chess master who could finally see the endgame approaching. The missing portfolio, the surgical thread, the mother-of-pearl button, all were pieces of a puzzle that was finally beginning to reveal its complete picture. "Mes amis," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him legendary. "We have spent this evening watching a most elaborate performance, but the true drama, the one that will determine who lives and who dies before dawn, is only now beginning." Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on Ashworth Park, sealing them all within the ancient walls where justice delayed had become justice perverted. The anonymous telegram's warning had been accurate. Murder would indeed be committed before Christmas morning. But the victim would not be the one anyone expected, and the killer remained hidden behind a mask of respectability and carefully maintained innocence. The little grey cells worked with increasing urgency as Poirot realized that all the evening's revelations had been leading to this moment. Someone had used the household's guilty secrets as both weapon and shield, orchestrating a deadly game where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. Time was running short, and in the pre-dawn darkness, the final act of this deadly Christmas drama was about to begin. The pre-dawn hours at Ashworth Park stretched with the peculiar tension of a household balanced on the knife's edge between revelation and catastrophe. Poirot had insisted that everyone remain in the library until morning, ostensibly for their mutual protection, though his keen eyes suggested he had other motives for maintaining this forced vigil. The little Belgian detective stood before the dying fire, his usually immaculate appearance showing the first signs of the night's exertions. A slight disorder to his mustache, a barely perceptible wrinkle in his waistcoat that spoke of a mind working at tremendous speed. The systematic examination. "Mes amis," Poirot announced with quiet authority. "The time has come for a small but necessary inconvenience. I must examine the outer garments worn by each person this evening. There is a particular scent that interests me greatly." The request sent a visible tremor through the assembled household. Roderick's hand tightened on his brandy glass, while Diana's fingers moved unconsciously to smooth the cuffs of her dark evening gown. Miss Courtney, whose composure had been rebuilt laboriously after her earlier confession, seemed to shrink further into her chair. "What sort of scent?" Dr. Pemberton asked, though his voice carried a note of professional concern that suggested he already suspected the answer. "Antiseptic, Doctor. A very particular combination of carbolic acid and ether, the kind used in medical procedures." Poirot's eyes fixed on each face in turn, cataloguing the subtle shifts of expression that flickered like candlelight across their features. "Someone has been very ingenious with surgical supplies this evening." Higgins, with the solemnity of a court officer, collected wraps and outer garments into his arms. When Diana hesitated over her knitted shawl, Poirot was watching. When Miss Courtney relinquished a dark cardigan that had been folded beneath her evening wrap, he noted how her fingers lingered on the fabric as if reluctant to part with it. The examination that followed was methodical and damning. Diana's shawl bore the faint but unmistakable scent of chloroform, while Miss Courtney's cardigan showed traces of the same chemical compound. Most telling of all, however, was the discovery of several black silk threads caught in the buttons of Dr. Pemberton's evening coat, threads that matched exactly the surgical silk found at the Blue Room. The mother-of-pearl revelation. Poirot produced the small, iridescent button he had discovered beside the study safe, holding it to the lamplight where it gleamed like a captured star. "Such buttons are not common," he observed conversationally. "They are expensive, delicate, and typically found only on the finest garments. A lady's evening, cuff perhaps, or the sleeve of an expensive dressing gown." The effect was immediate and telling. Diana's hand moved instinctively to her left cuff, where a small gap in the mother-of-pearl buttons was now visible. Miss Courtney's eyes widened as she realized the implication, while Lady Constance examined her own sleeves with the sharp attention of a woman suddenly aware of her vulnerability. "The button was dropped during the theft of the portfolio from the study safe," Poirot continued. "Dropped by someone who had intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's filing system and who possessed both the combination to the safe and the key to the study itself. The escalating crime." It was at this moment that the household's fragile equilibrium was shattered by a new development. Higgins appeared in the doorway, his usually impeccable composure badly shaken. "I beg your pardon, my lady, but Lady Constance's jewelry case has been broken into. The Ashworth diamonds are missing, and there are signs of a struggle in her private sitting room." The announcement struck the gathering like a physical blow. Lady Constance rose from her chair with surprising vigor, her face pale but her bearing still regal. "Impossible. The case was locked and the key was in my evening bag." "The bag was left unattended in the library during coffee," Higgins reminded her gently. "Anyone might have taken the key during the confusion following the Blue Room incident." Poirot's examination of Lady Constance's sitting room revealed the hallmarks of a carefully planned theft rather than a crime of opportunity. A handkerchief bearing the sweet, distinctive scent of chloroform lay crumpled beside her chair, and the jewelry case showed no signs of forcing. It had been opened with the proper key. Most significantly, the powder on her dressing table bore the clear impression of a hand pressed against its surface, and caught in the mahogany grain was another fragment of the telltale black surgical silk. The tightening net. "We are dealing with someone of considerable medical knowledge," Poirot announced to the reassembled household. "Someone who understands the precise dosage of chloroform required to render a person unconscious without causing permanent harm. Someone who has access to surgical supplies and who possesses an intimate knowledge of this household's routines and vulnerabilities." Dr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Mr. Poirot, surely you cannot suspect me of these crimes. I have served this family faithfully for over 20 years. Indeed, Doctor, and that faithful service has given you unparalleled access to both the household and its secrets. You knew about Sir Reginald's irregular business dealings, about Colonel James's morphine addiction, about the financial pressures facing various family members. Most importantly, you knew that someone in this house possessed documents that could destroy reputations and reveal 20 years of carefully hidden truths. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle, but Poirot was not finished. He moved to the window where the first pale light of Christmas morning was beginning to filter through the snow-laden glass. The hidden pattern. But the theft of the diamonds was not the primary objective. Poirot continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a man following a complex logical chain. It was, like the attack on Monsieur Blackwood, a distraction, a piece of theatre designed to obscure the true crime. Someone used the household's assumption that they were dealing with a simple case of blackmail and theft to mask a far more serious offense. He turned back to face the assembled group, his dark eyes bright with the satisfaction of a puzzle nearing its solution. The anonymous telegram that summoned me here was accurate in its warning. Murder was indeed planned for tonight, but the intended victim was not who any of us expected. The killer has been hiding behind a mask of respectability and professional authority. At that moment, a new sound echoed through the ancient house. The distant but unmistakable report of a gunshot, muffled by walls and corridors, but terrifyingly final in its implications. The assembled household froze, each person's face reflecting the same terrible realization. Despite all of Poirot's precautions, despite the careful gathering of evidence and the systematic elimination of possibilities, someone had finally committed the murder that had been threatened from the very beginning. The little grey cells had worked with remarkable speed and precision, but they had not worked quickly enough. Somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of Ashworth Park, the Christmas guest who wasn't invited had finally claimed their victim, in the game of cat and mouse that had been played throughout the long winter night, had reached its deadly conclusion. As the echo of the gunshot faded into the storm-muffled silence, Poirot straightened his waistcoat with characteristic precision and prepared to face the final, most terrible revelation of his investigation. The time for theories and deductions had passed. Now came the moment of truth, when all the careful analysis of the little grey cells would be tested against the harsh reality of murder most foul. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation between justice and evil, and somewhere in the shadows of the ancient manor house, a killer was preparing to face the consequences of their carefully planned crime. The gunshot's echo reverberated through Ashworth Park's ancient corridors like the tolling of a funeral bell, shattering the fragile tension that had held the household in its grip throughout the long winter night. Poirot was in motion before the sound had fully died away, his compact frame moving with surprising agility through the maze of passages. The assembled household following in a desperate procession of rustling silk and muffled footsteps. The grim discovery. Their destination was inevitable, the Blue Room in the West Wing, where Silas Blackwood had been confined for what everyone had hoped would be his own protection. The door, which Higgins had secured with both lock and chain after the earlier staged attack, now stood wide open, the chain hanging in broken links like a discarded necklace. The sight that greeted them within would be seared into their memories for the remainder of their lives. Silas Blackwood lay sprawled across the Persian carpet, his gaunt form twisted at an unnatural angle, one arm flung out toward the fireplace as if reaching for warmth that would never come. The front of his dressing gown bore a dark, spreading stain that gleamed wetly in the pale light filtering through the snow-laden windows. His pale eyes, which had held such bitter amusement only hours before, now stared sightlessly at the ceiling, reflecting nothing but the cold emptiness of death. Beside his outstretched hand lay Colonel James's Webley revolver, its dull metal surface catching the wan light of Christmas morning. The acrid scent of cordite hung in the air like an accusation, mingling with the sweeter smell of snow and the lingering traces of the chloroform that had been used in the earlier deception. Dr. Pemberton rushed forward with professional instinct, dropping to his knees beside the motionless form. His fingers sought the pulse point at Blackwood's throat, then moved to examine the wound with the practiced efficiency of a man who had encountered death in many forms. "Shot through the heart," he announced, his voice carefully controlled despite the tremor in his hands. Death would have been instantaneous. The impossible situation. "But how?" Diana whispered, her face pale as the snow outside. The door was locked, the chain was in place. Higgins had the only key, and it never left Lady Constance's possession. Indeed, the situation presented what appeared to be an impossible puzzle. Lady Constance produced the brass key from her evening bag, her diamonds catching the light as her hands shook slightly. "I've had this key since Higgins brought it to me after the earlier incident. It has not left my person." Higgins nodded confirmation, his usual composure badly shaken. "I secured the room myself, my lady. Both lock and chain were properly fastened. No one could have entered without breaking down the door." Poirot, however, was not examining the door or questioning the household about keys and alibis. Instead, he moved with methodical precision around the room, his keen eyes cataloguing every detail with the systematic thoroughness that had made him legendary. He knelt beside Blackwood's body without touching it, studying the position of the weapon and the angle of the wound. The forensic revelation. "Mes amis," Poirot said quietly, his voice cutting through the shocked murmurs of the assembled household. "This is not suicide, despite the convenient placement of the weapon. Observe, if you please, the hands of our deceased blackmailer." He indicated Blackwood's right hand, which lay palm up beside the revolver. No powder burns, no blackening between thumb and forefinger. When a man fires a heavy revolver at close range, the gases and particles leave unmistakable traces. These hands are clean, too clean for a man who has just discharged a firearm. Dr. Pemberton leaned closer, his professional curiosity overcoming his shock. "You're quite right, and the angle of entry. It's too steep for a self-inflicted wound. The bullet traveled upward, as if fired from below." "Precisely, Doctor. And observe this." Poirot indicated a faint smudge of pale powder on Blackwood's left hand. "Cosmetic powder, of the kind found on a lady's dressing table. Our victim has been arranged, shall we say, after his death." The mechanical solution. Moving to the mantelpiece, Poirot's attention was drawn to the ceramic shepherdess that had been shattered during the earlier attack. But now he noticed something that had been overlooked in the confusion. A thin scratch in the polished wood of the mantel, directly above where the figurine had stood. "The first incident," Poirot announced with growing certainty, "was not an attack at all, but preparation. Someone used that earlier chaos to install a mechanism, a simple but effective device that could fire the revolver from a distance." He examined the scratch more closely with his magnifying glass. A thin wire or cord was secured here, running to a simple trigger mechanism. The shot that shattered the shepherdess was not aimed at Monsieur Blackwood. It was a test to ensure the device would function properly when the time came for murder. The household stared in horrified fascination as Poirot reconstructed the crime. The killer had used the confusion of the staged attack to install their mechanical contrivance, then returned later to activate it from outside the locked room. The device had been designed to fire the weapon, then release it to fall beside the victim's hand, creating the illusion of suicide. The connecting thread. But who had the knowledge to construct such a device? Miss Courtney asked, her voice barely audible. "Someone with access to medical supplies, surgical instruments, and considerable mechanical aptitude," Poirot replied, his eyes moving systematically from face to face. "Someone who understood that the earlier staged attack would provide the perfect cover for installing their murder weapon." He produced from his pocket the fragment of black surgical silk he had found at the scene of the first incident. The same material used in both crimes, first to manipulate the door chain, then to operate the firing mechanism. Our killer has been most consistent in their choice of tools. As the pale light of Christmas morning grew stronger, filtering through the snow-crusted windows of the Blue Room, Poirot surveyed the assembled household with the satisfaction of a man whose long night's work was approaching its climax. The impossible murder had been revealed as an ingenious but ultimately discoverable crime, and the mechanical contrivance that had made it possible lay exposed like the workings of a broken clock. The final approach. "The person who killed Silas Blackwood," Poirot announced with quiet authority, "is someone who has been planning this crime for weeks, perhaps months. Someone who knew that Blackwood's arrival would provide the perfect opportunity to eliminate a dangerous threat while surrounded by convenient suspects. Someone who understood that the household's guilty secrets would provide ample motive for murder, making it difficult to identify the true killer among so many potential candidates." The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime 6 o'clock, its deep, resonant tones echoing through the silent house like a funeral dirge. Christmas morning had arrived at Ashworth Park, but instead of joy and celebration, it had brought death and the promise of justice long delayed. The little grey cells had worked with their customary precision, unraveling even the most ingenious deception. Now it remained only for Poirot to gather all the threads together and reveal the identity of the killer who had turned Christmas Eve into a night of murder and mechanical contrivance. The final act of this deadly drama was about to begin, and somewhere among the assembled suspects, a murderer was preparing to face the consequences of their carefully planned crime. The pale light of Christmas morning filtered through the snow-laden windows of Ashworth Park as Poirot gathered the household in the grand salon for what he knew would be the final act of this deadly drama. He had arranged the chairs in a precise semicircle before the fireplace, each position calculated to allow him to observe every subtle shift of expression, every telltale gesture that might reveal the last hidden truth, the systematic unraveling. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him legendary, "we stand at the conclusion of a most complex case, one that involves not a single crime, but multiple deceptions woven together with the skill of a master craftsman. To understand the murder of Silas Blackwood, we must first untangle the web of subsidiary crimes that were designed to conceal the true motive for his death." He moved to a small table beside his chair, upon which he had arranged several items like pieces on a chessboard. 3 crimes were committed in this house last night, each serving a different purpose in the killer's grand design. Let us examine them in the order they were planned, not the order in which they were discovered. The diamond deception. Poirot lifted a small handkerchief, still bearing the sweet scent of chloroform. First, the theft of Lady Constance's diamonds. The jewel case was opened with the proper key, not forced, indicating someone with intimate access to the household. The chloroform was applied with medical precision, rendering Lady Constance unconscious without harm. His eyes moved to Miss Courtenay, who sat rigid in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mademoiselle, your 20 years of loyal service to this family have been exemplary. It was that very loyalty that drove you to this desperate act. You believed that by giving Blackwood the diamonds, you could purchase his silence and protect Lady Constance from scandal." Miss Courtenay's composure finally cracked. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I took them. I thought if I could satisfy his demands, he would leave quietly and take his threats with him. I never meant permanent theft. I planned to return them this morning and claim they had been mislaid during the confusion." Lady Constance's face showed a mixture of shock and something approaching compassion. "Where are they now, Evelyn?" "Hidden behind the loose panel in your sitting-room escritoire, my lady. I placed them there when I heard the house stirring at dawn." The paper's protection. Poirot nodded gravely and turned his attention to Diana, whose left cuff still showed the gap where a mother-of-pearl button had been torn away. The second crime was the theft of Sir Reginald's papers from the study safe. The dust on the windowsill bore the clear impression of a left hand wearing a wedding ring. "Your hand, Madame Diana," as you steadied yourself while working at the safe. Diana's carefully maintained composure wavered. I took the portfolio, she admitted, color burning in her cheeks. Not to destroy evidence, but to protect my children's future. If Blackwood's accusations were true, if Uncle Reginald's fortune was built on illegal ventures, everything would be lost. Aunt Constance's reputation, our family's standing, my children's inheritance. And where did you conceal these dangerous documents? In the nursery chimney cupboard, behind the toy soldiers. I thought to show them to Aunt Constance this morning and beg her permission to burn the most damaging portions. The medical conspiracy. Both crimes, Poirot continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone, were committed by women acting from love and loyalty, however misguided. But the third crime, the murder of Silas Blackwood, springs from a far colder motive. He produced the fragments of black surgical silk, holding them to the lamplight where they gleamed like dark spider's web. This silk is not common household thread, but surgical material, waxed for strength, designed for medical procedures. It was used first to manipulate the door, chain during the staged attack, then later to operate the firing mechanism that killed Blackwood from outside his locked room. Dr. Pemberton had grown increasingly pale throughout these revelations, but his voice remained steady. Medical supplies are not uncommon in a household where I have served for 20 years, Mr. Poirot. Indeed not, Doctor, but combined with your intimate knowledge of this family's secrets, your presence at Colonel James' death 20 years ago, and your desperate financial circumstances, they create a most compelling picture. The financial desperation. Poirot moved closer to the doctor, his manner almost gentle despite the severity of his accusations. Your medical practice has been failing for months, has it not? The epidemic in Little Wickham strained your resources, your charitable nature led you to treat many patients who could not pay, and your own investments in pharmaceutical companies proved disastrous. You faced not merely financial ruin, but professional disgrace. The doctor's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his medical bag. Financial difficulties hardly make one a murderer, Mr. Poirot. No, but they provide motive when combined with opportunity and means. You knew that Blackwood's arrival threatened to expose not only Sir Reginald's illegal South African ventures, but your own role in covering up the true circumstances of Colonel James's death. You had falsified the death certificate, claiming accident when you knew it was murder followed by suicide. The mechanical murder. But your true genius, Doctor, lay in the mechanical device you constructed to kill Blackwood from outside his locked room. Poirot produced a small diagram he had sketched during his investigation. Using your knowledge of ballistics and your access to surgical instruments, you created a simple but effective mechanism. The surgical silk was anchored to the mantelpiece. That scratch we discovered was where you secured the wire. The device was designed to pull the trigger of Colonel James's Webley revolver, then release it to fall beside the victim's hand, suggesting suicide. The color drained entirely from Dr. Pemberton's face. This is pure speculation. On the contrary, Doctor, the evidence is quite substantial. Poirot produced a small vial from his pocket. Chloroform, found in your medical bag. The same substance used to render Lady Constance unconscious. And these? He held up several black threads. Surgical silk caught in the buttons of your evening coat, left there when you brushed against your own mechanism while removing it after the murder. The complete confession. The accumulated weight of evidence finally broke through Dr. Pemberton's defenses. His shoulders sagged as 20 years of carefully maintained respectability crumbled around him. I never intended for it to become so complicated, he said, his voice hollow with defeat. When Blackwood arrived with his threats and demands, I saw my entire life's work crashing down around me. The debts, the failed investments, the compromises I had already made, each step led inevitably to the next. He looked up at Lady Constance with something approaching anguish. You trusted me with your family's secrets while I watched my own world collapse. Do you know what it's like to smile and maintain dignity while facing complete ruin? Blackwood's death would eliminate the threat to both of us, and the diamonds would provide the means to start over elsewhere. The anonymous warning. But you made one crucial error, Doctor, Poirot said quietly. You sent the anonymous telegram yourself, didn't you? Not to prevent murder, but to ensure that a detective of reputation would be present to witness what appeared to be an impossible crime. You wanted the locked room mystery investigated and solved, but solved incorrectly, with the conclusion that Blackwood had taken his own life in despair. Dr. Pemberton nodded slowly. I thought if Hercule Poirot himself declared it suicide, no one would question the verdict. The great detective's reputation would seal the case forever. The final justice. As the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 8 o'clock on Christmas morning, Poirot surveyed the assembled household with the satisfaction of a complex puzzle finally completed. The mechanical murder had been exposed, the subsidiary crimes explained, and the killer's elaborate deception laid bare in all its calculated cruelty. The person who killed Silas Blackwood, Poirot announced with quiet finality, was someone who used medical knowledge to commit the perfect crime, who exploited this family's guilty secrets as both weapon and shield, and who nearly succeeded in turning Christmas Eve into the scene of an undetectable murder. The storm had finally passed, leaving Ashworth Park buried beneath a pristine blanket of snow that sparkled in the pale winter sunlight. Inside the ancient manor house, justice had finally arrived, cold and inexorable as the Yorkshire winter, but no less certain for its long delay. Dr. Marcus Pemberton, respected physician and trusted family friend, would face the consequences of his carefully calculated crimes. The Christmas guest who wasn't invited had been silenced forever, but the truth, meticulously assembled by the little gray cells, would ensure that his death was not in vain. The long night at Ashworth Park was finally over, and with it, 20 years of hidden guilt and delayed justice had come to their inevitable end. The pale light of Christmas morning transformed Ashworth Park into a crystalline wonderland, but within the grand salon, the atmosphere remained heavy with the weight of revelations that had shattered lives and exposed decades of carefully buried secrets. Dr. Pemberton sat with the resigned dignity of a man who had finally laid down an unbearable burden, his confession having drained something essential from him, leaving behind only the hollow shell of respectability he had maintained for so many years. The arrival of justice. The sound of approaching vehicles crunching through the snow announced the arrival of Inspector Vale from York, his motor fitted with chains and followed by the village constable on horseback. By then, Higgins had restored order to the house with characteristic efficiency. Fires blazed in every grate. The windows flashed with after-snow sunlight, and the body in the blue room had been decently covered, awaiting official examination. Poirot took the inspector through the sequence with the methodical clarity of a master craftsman explaining his work. In the blue room, he demonstrated the scratch on the mantelpiece where the firing mechanism had been anchored, the absence of powder burns on Blackwood's hands that proved the impossibility of suicide, and the unnatural angle of the wound that could only have been inflicted by a device operated from outside the locked room. The telegram warning of murder was placed by telephone from the surgery at 2:25. Poirot explained to Inspector Vale, a practical man with little patience for theatrical mysteries. Mrs. Finch at the post office recalls the voice distinctly, very polite, asking her to read back the words twice. She recognized the doctor's manner from years of prescription calls. He always addressed her as Madame, a courtesy that amused him. Dr. Pemberton offered no denial. He sat with his medical bag at his feet, hands folded with the composure of a man awaiting an inevitable but unpleasant operation. When cautioned by Inspector Vale, he simply bowed his head. I shall make a complete statement. It will save us all considerable time and trouble. The deeper confession. As the inspector prepared his official documents, Dr. Pemberton's full confession revealed the tragic complexity that had driven him to murder. You must understand, he said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man speaking from the depths of despair. "I never intended to become a killer. Each compromise led to the next. Each small deception demanded a larger one to maintain the facade. The story that emerged painted a picture of gradual moral decay spanning 2 decades. The falsification of Colonel James's death certificate had been the first step, ostensibly to spare the family scandal, but really to protect his own position. He had been illegally supplying the colonel with morphine for his war-induced addiction, a practice that would have destroyed his medical career if exposed. "My practice was failing," Pemberton continued, his professional composure finally cracking entirely. "The pharmaceutical investments I had trusted with my savings proved to be elaborate frauds. I faced not merely bankruptcy, but professional ruin and probable imprisonment. When Blackwood arrived with his threats and intimate knowledge of the household's secrets, I saw my entire life's work crashing down around me. The revelation of truth. It was then that Poirot delivered the most devastating revelation of all. From his waistcoat pocket, he produced a yellowed letter bearing Colonel James's distinctive handwriting. This was found among Blackwood's effects, a letter explaining the true nature of the South African ventures. "Monsieur, Silas Blackwood was not the villain you believed him to be." The letter revealed that Sir Reginald's mining profits had originally been intended as a charitable fund for the families of soldiers killed in the war. Colonel James and Blackwood had served as trustees, but Sir Reginald had gradually perverted the fund for his own purposes, using the money to build his personal fortune while the widows and orphans remained in poverty. "Blackwood came here not to destroy this family," Poirot continued, his voice heavy with the tragedy of it all, "but to claim what was rightfully owed to the families of his fallen comrades. His 20-year delay was due to his own financial struggles and the difficulty of proving his case without Colonel James's supporting testimony. The impact on Dr. Pemberton was devastating. His face crumpled as the full weight of his crime became clear. "You mean I murdered an innocent man? That all my planning, all my careful preparation, was to eliminate someone who posed no real threat to anyone but Sir Reginald's posthumous reputation?" "Not innocent, perhaps," Poirot replied gently, "but not the villain you imagined. His methods were questionable, his approach heavy-handed, but his cause was just. You killed a man who sought only to fulfill a promise made to dying soldiers 20 years ago. The restoration of order." As Dr. Pemberton was led away in handcuffs, his medical bag confiscated as evidence of his elaborate crime, the household began the slow process of healing from wounds that had festered for 2 decades. Higgins, with the solemnity of a court officer, retrieved the Ashworth diamonds from their hiding place behind the escritoire panel at Miss Courtney's direction. They lay in Lady Constance's palm like frozen drops of light, their brilliance somehow dimmed by the night's revelations. Diana, her face still bearing the strain of her own desperate actions, approached Poirot with quiet dignity. "The papers from Uncle Reginald's safe. What should be done with them?" "Those documents, madame," Poirot replied with characteristic wisdom, "represent a past that has already claimed too many victims. Justice has been served for Monsieur Blackwood's murder. Perhaps, for the sake of your children's future, a discreet burning in the library fireplace might prove the most judicious course." Lady Constance, her composure restored but forever changed by the night's revelations, made her decision with characteristic authority. "The family solicitors will establish the charitable fund that should have existed 20 years ago. Whatever restitution can be made to the families of those South African ventures will be made, quietly and completely. There has been enough scandal. Let there now be justice without spectacle." The philosophical reflection. As the police vehicles departed through the snow-carved canyon that had been cut through the drifts, carrying Dr. Pemberton toward a fate that would see him face the ultimate penalty, Poirot stood alone in the library, contemplating the human wreckage scattered around him. A respected physician had become a calculating murderer, A loyal companion had turned to theft, and a loving mother had compromised her principles, all because of secrets that should have been revealed decades earlier. "It is often the most respectable who have the most to hide," he mused to the assembled household, his voice carrying the weight of long experience with human nature's darker aspects. "And the most trusted who are capable of the greatest betrayals. Dr. Pemberton's crime was not merely murder, but the perversion of the healing arts into instruments of death. The little grey cells had worked with their customary precision, unraveling even the most ingenious mechanical deception. But the true mystery, Poirot reflected, had not been how Silas Blackwood died, but how so many fundamentally decent people had allowed fear and desperation to corrupt their moral foundations. The Christmas morning departure. When the time came for departure, Poirot stood in the pillared hall where order had been wounded and restored. Lady Constance, her dignity intact despite the night's betrayals, extended her hand in gratitude. "Mr. Poirot, without your intervention, Dr. Pemberton's crime might never have been discovered, and an innocent man would have been branded as suicide." "Perhaps, madame, but truth has its own momentum." The little grey cells merely accelerated the process and ensured that justice was served before more innocent lives could be destroyed. Diana approached with a small parcel, a knitted muffler in sober grey, pressing it upon him with wordless gratitude. "For the moustaches," Poirot said gravely, and the first genuine smile in many hours touched his lips. "They abhor the cold." On the steps, he paused to look back into the house that had endured both war and winter and its own terrible secrets. "Christmas is the season for taking inventory," he observed to Lady Constance, "not merely of gifts, but of debts. This year, madame, you have chosen to settle yours. And you, Mr. Poirot, what do you receive for your Christmas?" He touched 2 fingers to his breast over the region of his heart. "Order in the little grey cells, madame. It is my preferred present. And perhaps—" He nodded toward the snow-covered park where the morning sun was beginning to melt the pristine surface. "The chance for new writing upon clean paper. That is a good thing, even for ancient families." As his motor crunched away down the drive, Poirot settled back into his seat, warm within his coat and the grey muffler. Behind him, Ashworth Park began the work of mending, not just broken trust and shattered reputations, but the fundamental moral order that had been so grievously damaged by 20 years of buried secrets and delayed justice. The Christmas guest who wasn't invited had finally found peace, and the ancient manor house settled into the quiet that comes when truth has been served, and the little grey cells have restored order to a world temporarily thrown into chaos. In the end, justice had prevailed, not through vengeance, but through the methodical application of logic, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to the truth, however painful it might prove to be. "A curious knoll indeed," Poirot murmured as the motor carried him away through the sparkling winter landscape. "But at the end, order, and that, for Hercule Poirot, is the greatest gift of all." The motor car moved steadily through the snow-carved lanes leading away from Ashworth Park, its chains biting rhythmically into the packed surface as the ancient manor house receded into the crystalline Yorkshire landscape. Poirot settled back against the leather seats, his usually immaculate appearance showing the first signs of the long night's exertions, a barely perceptible disorder to his mustache, a slight wrinkle in his waistcoat that spoke of a mind that had worked at tremendous speed through the dark hours of Christmas Eve. The immediate reflection. As the Bentley carried him toward the railway station, Poirot found himself contemplating the human wreckage left in the wake of Dr. Pemberton's elaborate deception. The case had revealed layers of moral compromise that had festered beneath Ashworth Park's genteel surface for 2 decades, each secret feeding upon the others until murder seemed the only solution to an impossible situation. The little grey cells, having worked with their customary precision to unravel even the most ingenious mechanical contrivance, now turned to the deeper mystery of human nature itself. How did a healer become a killer? How did loyalty become theft? How did family love become criminal conspiracy? The answers lay not in the mechanical device that had fired Colonel James's Webley from outside a locked room, but in the gradual erosion of moral foundations that had made such desperate measures seem necessary. The London aftermath. A week later, in his comfortable London flat, Poirot received the first of what would become a steady correspondence from Yorkshire. Lady Constance's handwriting, uncompromising and upright, conveyed her decisions with characteristic efficiency. The solicitors had established the charitable fund under the original charter that Sir Reginald had perverted. The most damaging papers had been destroyed, the remainder sealed. A portion of the estate's liquid holdings would provide the initial endowment for the families of the fallen soldiers. Inspector Vale's visit brought official closure to the case. "You drew him like a bad tooth, Monsieur Poirot," the inspector observed, accepting a cup of Poirot's excellent chocolate with resigned good humor. "Though I'll own I missed the first signs. What told you it was Pemberton?" "Not one thing, Inspector, but many small things," Poirot replied, his fingers composing themselves along the cup's handle. The odor of antiseptic on garments that had no business carrying it, the surgical silk of a quality I recognized from medical procedures, the manner in which he pronounced instantaneous at Blackwood's death. Too quickly, before his examination justified such certainty. And there was the telegram itself. Mrs. Finch's mention that the caller addressed her as Madame revealed the doctor's characteristic courtesy. The character resolutions. Over the following months, letters arrived providing updates on the household's gradual healing. Miss Courtney had not been dismissed despite her theft of the diamonds. 20 years of faithful service, Lady Constance wrote, should not be overshadowed by one night of desperate folly. She had been appointed secretary to the new charitable fund, her intimate knowledge of the family's affairs proving invaluable in making proper restitution. Diana Hartwell's theft of the incriminating documents had, paradoxically, preserved evidence crucial to establishing the fund's legitimacy. Her appointment as the fund's administrator allowed her to provide for her children's education while serving the cause of justice. Her husband's medical practice had prospered. Association with the Ashworth name, even under such circumstances, carried considerable social weight in Yorkshire. Most remarkably, Roderick Ashworth had undergone a complete transformation. The shock of the night's events had jolted him from his dissolute lifestyle into something approaching responsibility. He had accepted management of the estate's agricultural operations, throwing himself into modernizing the farming methods with energy that surprised everyone, including himself. The deeper truth. The most disturbing revelation came during Dr. Pemberton's final confession before his execution. The anonymous telegram that had summoned Poirot had not been sent to prevent murder, but to ensure that it would be witnessed by someone whose reputation would lend credibility to the desired conclusion. Pemberton had wanted Hercule Poirot present not as the detective who would solve the case, but as the unwitting accomplice who would provide the final seal of authenticity to an elaborate suicide deception. "I was meant to declare Blackwood's death a perfect suicide," Poirot reflected to his friend Hastings months later. The great irony is that his very cleverness became his downfall. Had he simply shot Blackwood and left the scene, the death might indeed have been ruled suicide. But his need to create an impossible crime that would baffle even the great detective provided exactly the clues necessary to expose his guilt. The final philosophy. As spring returned to London and the memory of that snowy Christmas Eve began to fade, Poirot often found himself contemplating the case's deeper lessons. The Christmas guest who wasn't invited had been revealed not as a villain, but as a man seeking justice for forgotten comrades. His 20-year quest had finally borne fruit, though he had not lived to see its completion. The monument erected in Cape Town bore Silas Blackwood's name among those honored, not as a blackmailer, but as a man who had kept faith with the dead. In the end, delayed justice had become perverted justice, then finally, through tragedy and revelation, had been restored to its proper form. Poirot straightened his waistcoat with characteristic precision and prepared his moustache for the evening's discipline. The little grey cells were at peace, having once again imposed order upon chaos. Yet the deeper mystery remained, the eternal struggle between truth and deception that played out in countless lives across the great city beyond his windows. "Order," he murmured into the quiet of his flat. "Even when it hurts, it is the true hospitality." Outside, London resumed its inexhaustible noise, but inside, justice had been served, and the Christmas guest who wasn't invited had finally found the peace that had eluded him for 20 years. The snowdrops appeared early that spring in the garden of Poirot's London residence, their white bells nodding like small acknowledgments of truth finally told. As he adjusted his tie in the morning mirror, the little Belgian detective reflected on how both flowers and justice have their own inexorable seasons, pushing through even the most compacted soil when their time arrives. The correspondence of resolution. Letters from Yorkshire had arrived with clockwork regularity throughout the winter months, each bearing news of the gradual healing that follows the surgical removal of long festering secrets. Lady Constance's communications, written in her characteristically uncompromising hand, chronicled the establishment and growth of the charitable fund with the same methodical precision she had once applied to managing her household's guilty secrets. The Ashworth Trust, operating under the original charter that Sir Reginald had perverted for his own purposes, had already distributed substantial settlements to 13 families across the empire. The fund had grown beyond all expectations as word spread among former soldiers and their descendants. What had begun as restitution for a specific wrong had evolved into something approaching a moral reckoning with an entire generation's sacrifices. Miss Courtenay's transformation proved the most remarkable of all the household's metamorphoses. Her appointment as the fund's secretary had revealed administrative talents that decades of subservient companion duties had kept hidden. Her theft of the diamonds, initially viewed as betrayal, had paradoxically demonstrated the depth of her loyalty. She had risked everything to protect Lady Constance from scandal, and that devotion had ultimately been rewarded with genuine responsibility and purpose. Diana Hartwell's management of the fund's distribution had brought her into correspondence with families across 3 continents, revealing strengths she had never known she possessed. Her children, no longer quarantined by childhood diseases, had returned to fill Ashworth Park's ancient halls with laughter that had been absent for too many years. Even Roderick's reformation had proved genuine. His management of the estate's agricultural operations had transformed both the property and himself into something approaching respectability. The monument to memory. The most poignant communication arrived in early spring, accompanied by a photograph that would find a permanent residence on Poirot's mantelpiece. The image showed a newly unveiled monument in Little Wycombe's churchyard, carved from local Yorkshire stone and bearing a simple but profound inscription, "To the memory of those whose sacrifices built a fortune and whose truth was finally heard, and to Silas Blackwood, who remembered." Lady Constance's accompanying letter carried a note of quiet satisfaction. "The house feels lighter, Mr. Poirot. The shadows that clung to its corners for so long have finally dispersed. It seems that sometimes the truth, however painful, is the only way to truly cleanse a place and a family." The philosophical reckoning. When Hastings visited one afternoon, finding Poirot arranging the photograph beside a small mounted mother-of-pearl button, Diana's inadvertent confession preserved in iridescent testimony, he shook his head with familiar bewilderment. "I still marvel at how you knew it was Pemberton for certain," Hastings admitted. The mechanical ingenuity was remarkable, but surely others in the household possessed the necessary skills. Poirot settled back in his chair with the patient air of a teacher addressing a particularly persistent student. "Consider, mon ami, not merely the mechanical aspects, but the psychology. The need for the impossible suicide, the requirement that Hercule Poirot himself witness and validate the deception. This was not the work of a simple killer, but of a man whose pride demanded that even his crimes be acknowledged as masterpieces. He lifted the photograph, studying the monument's inscription in the afternoon light. Dr. Pemberton did not awaken one morning and decide to become a murderer. He descended by degrees, first falsifying a death certificate to protect his illegal morphine distribution, then using his medical knowledge to cover up the truth, finally employing those same skills to commit what he believed would be the perfect murder. Each compromise demanded a greater compromise to protect it, the deeper truth. The case had revealed layers of moral corruption that had festered beneath Ashworth Park's genteel surface for 2 decades, yet it had also demonstrated the possibility of redemption through truth, however painful that truth might prove. The Christmas guest who wasn't invited had been revealed not as a villain, but as a man seeking justice for forgotten comrades. His 20-year quest had finally borne fruit, though he had not lived to witness its completion. Truth, Poirot observed, performing his evening mustache ritual with characteristic precision, is like the Yorkshire snow. It covers everything equally, making all landscapes appear clean and pure. But beneath that pristine surface, the old contours remain unchanged. The wise man learns to read the hidden topography of human nature. The eternal vigilance. As London settled into another evening's rhythm beyond his windows, Poirot contemplated the eternal struggle between truth and deception that played out in countless lives across the great city. The little grey cells had worked with their customary precision, unraveling mechanical contrivances and exposing hidden motives. Yet the deeper mystery remained. Why do fundamentally decent people allow fear to transform them into criminals? The answer, he reflected, lay not in the mechanical device that had fired Colonel James's Webley from outside a locked room, but in the gradual erosion of moral foundations that had made such desperate measures seem necessary. Respectability had become a prison that demanded ever greater sacrifices to maintain, until the very reputation Dr. Pemberton sought to protect had ultimately corrupted him beyond redemption. The final satisfaction. On the anniversary of that snowy Christmas Eve, Poirot received one final communication from Yorkshire. Not a letter this time, but a small package containing a photograph of the Cape Town memorial where Silas Blackwood's name had been carved, alongside those of recognized heroes. The inscription read simply, "In memory of those who served with honor and those who honored their service." He placed this photograph beside the others on his mantelpiece, creating a small shrine to justice delayed but ultimately served. The Christmas guest who wasn't invited had found his final rest, and order had been restored to a corner of Yorkshire where secrets had festered too long in the shadows. Order, Poirot murmured into the quiet of his flat, straightening his waistcoat with characteristic precision. Even when it hurts, it is the true hospitality. Outside, London resumed its inexhaustible noise, but inside, justice had been served. Through the methodical application of logic, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to truth. The case was closed, but its lessons would endure as long as human nature struggled between the light of truth and the comfortable darkness of hidden guilt. The little grey cells maintained their eternal vigilance, ready for whatever mysteries the next season might bring, secure in the knowledge that order could always be restored to a world temporarily thrown into chaos. In the end, it was exactly as it should be, justice prevailing not through vengeance, but through the patient unraveling of deception, one thread at a time, until the truth stood revealed in all its terrible and necessary beauty.